Hello, students, and welcome to another episode of College Prep World History. I'm Mr. Willis, and this time we're going to go a little bit away from the combativeness of the Soviet Union and the United States and their furthering chilled relationship during the Cold War, and we're going to go to another major developing superpower that we see here in the world in 2021. And that's China. China, which we haven't really talked about in world history a lot because of the relative backwardness, so to speak, of their modernization movement. And we're going to see them try to take a step forward, okay, or as Mao would say, a great leap forward during this Cold War era. And we're going to see how they evolve into the communist power that they are currently as well. Because if you look at the structure of their government, even though they do have democratic voting systems, those voting systems are very much biased and skewed into the form of communist regimes. So we're going to go ahead and see how that begins. So we need to talk a little bit about their history first. And so we're going to see a little bit about how China is torn in two. Okay, and you can see that with the picture of Mao here on our title picture. And our first slide is going to be a really quick history lesson in regards to China. So this information you do not need to write down, but I want to just give you a little context. So if we were taking advanced placement world history, we would have covered China from the beginning, which is one of our first civilizations in the world. For thousands of years, China has been ruled by various dynasties or ruling families. And since 1644, the Qin emperors, the Qin dynasty had ruled over the Chinese empire. And it wasn't until the latter half of 1911 into 1912 when the Qin dynasty ends and the beginning of a democratic system is put into place in China, and that is with this pro-democratic nationalist force, which defeats the Qin dynasty in 1911. Yes, there is a lot of history of internal struggle and warfare in China, and that revolution sets the stage for the election of a president, which for a brief period of time, through about a 20 to 30 year period, we're going to see democratic systems put into place. We're going to see the election of a president. And again, we're going to kind of fast forward from that slide into what happens around World War II and into the 1950s. So what happens to China during World War II? Well, they support the Allied forces. We are going to be taking a look at what happens during the war in terms of them helping the Doolittle raid and those members of the Air Force who bombed Tokyo during the Doolittle raid, and they tried to save members of the Doolittle raid, those American pilots. And for their effort during the war, 22 million Chinese are going to be executed by the Japanese. And so even though we don't really talk about the brutality of the Japanese during World War II, it is important to bear in mind that they are very, very brutal, and they practice brutal tactics, which were discussed during the rape of Nanjing. They are going to be very brutal towards the Chinese, and they're going to kill civilians throughout the 20s, 30s, and into the 40s. And so the area of northern China, Manchuria, will be invaded. It will be under the control of the Japanese, and there will be continuing growing internal tension within China throughout this period of time because of how weak the leadership is of these democratic forces due to their brutal subjugation by the Japanese. So for this slide, you don't need to write anything down. Again, we want to just give you a little bit of context of what's happening in China during this period. And so our next slide, which will be where we begin to take notes, will be rather important. Okay, this is where we see the verge of civil war take place, all right? And we need to talk about the two sides of the Civil War, the Chinese Civil War. The first side is the communist side, all right? So we want to write down Mao Zedong, Right, Mao Zedong is the leader of the communist forces. He will be known as Chairman Mao after his victory. So communists led by Mao Zedong, all right, they're in northern China, mostly northern China. All right, and again, we want to talk about, why the communists are really supported by the poorest of classes. And again, it's because what Mao and his supporters are suggesting are very attractive to the poorest classes in China, and so he's going to garner a lot of support from the poorest of people, which make up a vast majority of the Chinese citizens. They're going to support his candidacy for being leader of the Chinese government. So we want to know here on the slide, Mao is the leader of the communists in northern China. He's supported by the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union, remember, wants to have as much communism spread all over the world that they possibly can, because that means they have supporters, they have allies that will help them in their battle against the democratic forces of the United States. They're going to be supported by peasants. And then finally, one of the reasons why they're going to be rather successful in the Civil War is because of the tactics they use to fight against the organized armies of the democratic government, and that's the use of guerrilla warfare. That's Guerrilla warfare. And basically what guerrilla warfare is if you're not a superior force, you have to use some sort of surprise tactics, or you have to be able to be effective in smaller forces to combat a larger force. And that's how you get them frustrated, is by committing these guerrilla tactics that will be effective in fighting against a much more superior force. So that's our communist side. On our next slide, we're going to talk about the nationalists, which are our pro-democratic forces. And those pro-democratic forces are going to be led by the president of the Republic of China, who is Chiang Kai-shek, or he's also known by another name, and that name is Jiang Jieshi. So write down Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the Democratic Nationalist Forces, all right, president of the Republic of China in 1928. And despite the fact that he has a triple the size of the communist army, he is going to lose this civil war against the communists. And that is because, despite the fact that the United States supports the nationalist forces of China with $2 billion in aid, the people of China do not support the nationalist army. They don't support it because of the corruption that is brought forth by the government, right? And whether it be inflation of prices, okay, nobody wants to see inflation of prices, especially goods that you need to eat, right? If you have inflation of prices of food, that's not good for your government. And it might be good for your business, but the people want to have the opportunity to have the same opportunities that the richer people do. And so these communists come in and promise them equality. They promise them things that they wouldn't normally get under a democratic regime. And so they're going to side with the communists. And ultimately, this to kind of break down this Chinese Civil War, and the important piece that you need to know is that throughout the course of the Civil War, troops are going to desert the nationalist army and go to the communist side because the people are supportive of the communist side. And so it's the nationalist army is going to crumble from within because of its lack of support by the citizens that live within China. So make sure you write down Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the nationalist forces. This is the democratic side. Supported by the United States, but not supported by its own peoples. Therefore, they will lose the civil war between the communists. And so this leaves us, as a result of this civil war, it leads to a communist victory. And the United States becomes rather fearful of the communist regime now that is taking place in China. There's a communist regime in the Soviet Union. There's growing communist regimes in Eastern Europe. So this is becoming rather fearful for the United States because they're afraid that communists are going to take over the world. And so this is going to push the United States into trying to combat communism with their own force, with their own tactics that they're going to use. Containment is mentioned by Mr. Gordon as one form. Brinkmanship is mentioned by me in another lesson where we're willing to go to the brink of nuclear war to win our way of life. And so we're going to see throughout the course of the 1950s that this growing Chinese communist government will sign a friendship treaty with the Soviet Union, although they're really not all that friendly, to be honest with you. We saw that with fascist regimes. Mussolini and Hitler did not necessarily get along, but they had similar leadership ideas and ideologies, so therefore they both worked on the same side. But the Soviets and the Chinese are not going to like one another, and they sign a friendship treaty more in solidarity to go against the United States than it is to actually be friends. And so what we see ultimately as the way of paying the price for the growing Chinese communist movement is that the forces that are remaining behind, the democratic forces that are remaining behind, that are unwilling to change to the communist side, are going to be completely forced out of China. And those forces are going to be exiled to the island of Taiwan, which they remained to this very day. Taiwan is not allowed to be formally recognized as an independent nation. It is part of China. And the United States has been very careful about acknowledging Taiwan as a separate nation because this would anger the communists in China, and we don't want to have that relationship sour more than it is already between the Chinese and the United States. And we're seeing maybe here in the last 5 or 6 years where the relationship between the Chinese and the United States has soured just a little bit because we have seen different movements by the U.S. government and the Chinese government to be a little bit combative. And again, that's not necessarily a military connotation, but we're starting to see some negative relations between the United States and the Chinese. All right, so at this point, we're going to show a video to you guys regarding the Chinese Civil War, and we'll pick it up on the other side of this video.
In the cities, people's lives had not improved after the war. Massive economic problems were undercutting Jiang's support. The government's financial policies were chaotic. The homeless and starving filled city streets. Black market trading and corruption were widespread. To make matters worse, in 1947, floods in the south destroyed the rice crop. And in the north, there was a devastating famine. In response, the United Nations Relief Agency sent millions of dollars in aid. America continued to send vast quantities of war surplus and millions more dollars to help Jiang in his struggle against the communists. Many were certain that Jiang's family was embezzling huge amounts of this aid. He and his wife continued to ask for more. In 1947, President Truman sent Albert Wedemeyer back to China to assess the situation. Although it was clear that Jiang's government was corrupt and losing support, for America there was no alternative. Wedemeyer urged Jiang to effect immediate, drastic political and economic reforms. At the same time, he recommended more U.S. aid. But American aid could not win the war for Jiang. He made the crucial mistake of overextending his forces in the north. The communists responded with a change in tactics. They mounted a major offensive against the nationalist armies in the cities. The change of tactics worked. By November 1948, after only a month and a half, the communists won control of North China. With North China under communist control, the battle for central China began.
The nationalists failed because we completely lost the people's support. I had heard that during the northern expedition, the people gave us flowers and food. During the war against Japan, the people provided intelligence and helped us resist the Japanese. Once the Civil War started, we couldn't find anyone to give us even road directions. There is a saying in China, the water that carries the boat can also overturn it.
On January 21st, 1949, 11 days after the battle for central China, Chiang Kai-shek resigned. In Shanghai, people were leaving in droves. Chiang Kai-shek and his government retreated to the island of Taiwan. It was carefully planned. They took a huge part of China's art treasures and all of the central bank reserves. U.S. aid followed. The war continued without Chiang Kai-shek. The communists prepared to cross the Yangtze River, heading for Nanking and Shanghai. They quickly overcame nationalist defenses. With the communists just outside Shanghai, the remaining nationalist police stepped up their anti-communist activities.
On October 1st, 1949, we listened to the radio. We heard the ceremony of the founding of the People's Republic of China. Chairman Mao proclaimed that the Chinese people had stood up. All of us were overjoyed. We jumped around. We were really proud and happy.
So as you guys can see from the video there, the people of China were told by Mao and the communists that now that the communists had won the Civil War, the people have reclaimed the country for themselves. And so you can imagine how jubilant, you can imagine, and you saw it in the video, you can imagine how excited the people are going to be that the communists are taking over, because they've promised the people what they want to hear. And one of those steps is going to be taken here on our next slide. Now that the communists have put a stranglehold of power on the Chinese people, they're going to try to expand their borders. They're going to try to do what the Japanese had done, what all the other European, Western powers had done during the imperialistic age. They're going to try to take land that was not theirs and claim it for themselves. And so we're going to see after World War II, the Chinese are going to invade areas to the south. One particular area which was autonomous and ruled by itself was Tibet. And the leader of the Tibetan people is a man by the name of the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama is a spiritual as well as a political leader. He does a multitude of things for the Tibetan people. And when the Chinese invade, all right, with the help of the Soviet Union, when the Chinese invade into Tibet, the Dalai Lama, who is the head of the Tibetan people, must flee. He must leave because there is no way they can combat the power of the Soviet Union and the Chinese. The Tibetan people don't have that technology. They don't have that army or firepower to be able to do that. They're a peaceful people. And so in 1951, the communists take over Tibet. The Dalai Lama flees south to India for the protection of himself and has basically remained in exile for the entirety of his life. And so what we need to write down here is the expansion of communist China is into Tibet, right? That's really the one big thing you want to write down here, right? And the Dalai Lama is the head of the Tibetan people, right? Both a spiritual connotation as well as a political one. All right, so we're going to see a really quick video on who the Dalai Lama is and, how that person rules and how important he is to the Tibetan people and what the Chinese try to do to the Dalai Lama. And the future Dalai Lama is going to be talked about in the video.
He's one of the most well-known spiritual leaders of the 20th and 21st centuries. The present Dalai Lama is the 14th in a long line stretching back to the 1300s. The word Dalai means an ocean, implying an ocean of wisdom. Lama means teacher. Tibetans believe the Dalai Lamas are reincarnations of Bodhisattva Avalokitesvara. When the current Dalai Lama approaches old age, the search starts for the next reincarnation. Starting with the 5th Dalai Lama in the 1600s, they have led Tibet politically as well as spiritually. The 5th Dalai Lama built the Potala Palace, one of the most recognizable landmarks in Tibet. But the current Dalai Lama was forced to flee Tibet in 1959 and is currently living in exile in Dharamsala in northern India. His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, is best known for his representation of Tibetans in their struggle for freedom and human rights. In 1989, he won the Nobel Peace Prize for his, quote, consistent resistance to the use of violence in his people's struggle to regain their liberty. In 2011, the Dalai Lama retired from politics, breaking the 370-year tradition of the Dalai Lama being the political and spiritual leader of the Tibetan people. According to the tradition of reincarnation, the present Dalai Lama selects his successor. But when he selected a new Panchen Lama in 1995, Chinese authorities abducted the child, who was never seen again. The Chinese regime then appointed another Panchen Lama instead. Thus it remains unclear as to who will be the next Dalai Lama, the one Tibetans will recognize as their highest spiritual and political leader.
All right, so from the video there, you can see how the Chinese are a major threat to the future of Tibetan life and how the Dalai Lama and the future of the Dalai Lama is going to be threatened by the Chinese control over the Tibetan lands. And we're going to see that expansion continue to take place where the communists who are in charge of the government in China are going to want to continuously increase their power over the Chinese population by promising them things that they want to hear. And you're going to see that as the main goal in our first bullet point here, where you need to write this down. The main goal of the communist regime was to strengthen their grip on the people of China and to make China a powerful nation, which it's arguable at this point whether China is a powerful nation or not. It's really up to you guys to decide whether you believe that or not. Probably is, based upon the fact that there are a lot of Chinese goods being funneled into many different countries, mainly because of their low and cheap costs. So, but ultimately up to you to decide. And so we want to write down the term Marxist Socialism as well. And again, Marxist socialism is the idea. This socialism idea is about providing equality for all. All right, and the reality is equality for all is not really truly possible. You can't give everybody the same amount of farmland. You can't give everybody the same amount of opportunity to work. It's just not going to happen, because the person that's actually distributing this is Mao, is the communist regime. And so they're going to take what they want off the top. They're going to skim that off the top and provide for the rest of the people, and what's left is not enough. So a couple of examples of Marxist socialism within this communist Chinese regime would be, again, providing a workplace and a home for people. Women are going to be provided the opportunity to work as well, which is a huge step forward, right? That's a very progressive step forward in the 1950s for the Chinese people. State-sponsored healthcare, state-sponsored childcare, which you guys are going to see in a video upcoming about the Great Leap Forward. You're going to see what their version of childcare is. It's much more about indoctrination than anything else. So how can we make these people believe that the Chinese way of life is the only way of life or the best way of life? All right? And the reality of the situation is that more than 1 million people who resist this form of government are going to be killed rather than conform to the communist ideas. So that leads us to Mao's great initiative about the Great Leap Forward. So we want to write down the Great Leap Forward. This was his initiative to try to push China to become much more modern and to provide a lot of opportunity and provide a lot of industry and resources for the people. But it is an absolute, utter failure for the Chinese people. And so we want to write down the term communes under the Great Leap Forward. Communes are these large government-run farms. And I mentioned in the previous slide that the Chinese people were provided jobs, right? Well, these people were forced to work on these giant government-run farms. And you're going to see in the video that these people wanted to please the chairman. And so they're going to produce, or they're going to try to produce, these absolutely outrageous quotas of goods, of food, which is, there's no way they can meet those needs. There's no way, provided the land that they're given, that they could provide that much food. So they're just trying to please the chairman rather than reach a reasonable or attainable goal. And in 1953, we're going to see Mao try to focus on non-consumer goods. He's going to try to produce oil, electricity, and steel. You're going to see in the video people giving their walks and trying to produce other products with the steel that's melted down, and it is complete, utter waste of resources. And all it's going to do is actually lead to further death and destruction. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and show that video to you guys here on the Great Leap Forward, and then we have one last slide when we come back that will talk about the Cultural Revolution.
In 1958, Mao launched his most ambitious campaign to date, the Great Leap Forward. His goal was to make China the industrial equal of Western nations in just 15 years. His method was to mobilize the entire country to work day and night by promising a better future. Mao's word was so powerful that almost overnight, people's communes sprang up across China. A commune encompassed many villages with thousands of families. Each day was strictly regimented, and family life was virtually abolished. Children were placed in communal nurseries while their parents worked around the clock. People ate in the fields or in communal dining halls. To increase industrial output, communes were ordered to make steel. People collected walks, pots, bed frames, and tools, anything made of iron or steel. They built small furnaces to melt them. The biggest challenge was to keep the furnaces fueled.
At night, you could see many furnaces along the railroad. Fire shot out of the furnaces.
But the steel people made was useless.
People were unhappy, but nobody dared say anything. The result was that everything made of iron and steel was taken from every family and was made useless.
While the government called on everyone to make steel, they also wanted to increase farm output.
How could we increase the grain harvest? People said that if you did close planting and used more fertilizer, you would definitely increase output.
During the Great Leap Forward, we believed miracles could happen. There was a saying, "The corn will grow higher the more you desire." Communes and schools reported their wonderful news to the party. If one commune said they could turn out 150 tons an acre, another one would say their target was 180 tons. Each commune or school would promise a higher amount until the last school gave their highest figure. Our school set the target of 470 tons an acre. We dug a hole, something like a swimming pool. We thought if we put all the fertilizer in it, we would achieve our target. Then we poured the seeds in, which built up into a layer about this thick. There was a photograph in the People's Daily that showed the wheat in a field supporting the weight of children.
Some leaders of the Central Party Committee were so happy that they put this photo on their desks at work. Most people believed it.
We were surprised to see that photo and wondered how it could be possible. But because we were city people, we couldn't be sure it was a fake.
After the anti-rightist campaign, few dared to ask questions.
Later, I learned it was all fake. The peasants were putting on a show for us. They moved grain from other places and put it all in one field. It was all a show for Mao.
Under pressure to produce more, to launch satellites to heaven, as it was called, party officials inflated production figures. An ominous cycle began as the state took more and more grain based on false figures, leaving the peasants with nothing to eat. By the summer of 1959, the leaders knew the Great Leap Forward was going badly wrong. After his trip, Mao decided to moderate production targets. In July 1959, the party met at the mountain resort of Lushan to set new, realistic goals. Minister of Defense Peng Dehuai, the hero of the Korean War, was one of Mao's oldest revolutionary comrades. Peng wrote to Mao describing what he saw as the problems of the Great Leap Forward. What Peng intended as loyal criticism, Mao saw as political treachery. Zhou Enlai and Liu Shaoqi agreed with Peng, but even they did not dare speak out. As a result, production goals were not cut. Officials continued to demand more grain than the peasants could give. The Great Leap Forward continued through 1960. Millions of peasants were starving.
The famine was very severe and widespread, but newspapers did not report it at all. People only knew that their local area was suffering. To keep the news from spreading, peasants were not allowed to leave their areas, even to beg.
The famine lasted 3 years. An estimated 30 million people died. Mao's revolution, fought to give the Chinese people a better life, had helped create the largest famine in history.
So as you can see, despite the attempts by Mao and the communist regime to actually bring modernization and bring food and other good things to the Chinese people, he is an absolute utter failure in terms of providing that. and actually makes the problem worse by leading to a famine that will kill tens of millions of people within China. And so this is not going to be the only time where the Chinese will fail ultimately in trying to modernize itself or provide a change for its people. And that leads us to our final slide of this presentation, which covers the Cultural Revolution, which fundamentally Mao wanted the people, especially the youth of China, to experience that same revolutionary ideas and fervor and emotion that he felt when he defeated the democratic forces in the Chinese Civil War. He wanted to bring that to the next generation of Chinese. And so he encourages the formation of the Red Guards in the late 1950s. Now, prior to this, the Soviet Union and Chinese relationship, as I had mentioned before, is going to sour, it's going to strain. And so Mao initiates this group, this militia group, which are these untrained soldiers that are the ages of students, which ultimately would be your age and throughout college ages, called the Red Guards. And the Red Guards are going to try to embrace this same type of feeling that Mao had when he was successful in the Civil War. They're going to shut down schools. They're going to get rid of any material that they deem to be anti-communist, and they're going to basically stop any intellectual, upper intellectual movements that are taking place within the Chinese government to create this revolutionary feeling. And so what makes this dangerous is that these students are going to ultimately be too revolutionary in their movement, that Mao is going to have to shut down the Red Guards by threatening to either jail or kill them if they don't stop this revolutionary movement. So Mao has created this problem, this internal issue with his own people. He's provided them with an opportunity to try to create a better way of life, but has failed at every turn, essentially, throughout his regime to make it better for the people. And it concludes here on this slide with the Cultural Revolution that ends up with either the jailing or killing of students who, at his own command, had wanted to embrace this revolutionary idea or these feelings. Well, that's our presentation for today. On behalf of the entire World History team, I am Mr. Willis, and we will see you guys again soon.